Wenn die Sonne niedersinket und der Tag zur Ruh sich neigt, Luna freundlich leise winket und die Nacht herniedersteigt. Wenn die Sterne prächtig schimmern, 1000 Sonnenstrahlen flimmern, fühlt die Seele sich so groß, windet sich vom Staube los. Schaut so gern nach jenen Sternen, wie zurück ins Vaterland, hin nach jenen lichten Fernen und vergisst der Erde Tand. Will nur erringen, will nur streben, ihrer Hülle zu entschweben. Erde ist ihr enger und klein, auf den Sternen möcht sie sein. Ob der Erde Stürme toben, falsches Glück den Bösen lohnt, hoffend blicket sie nach oben, wo der Sternenrichter thront. Keine Furcht kann sie mehr quälen, keine Macht kann ihr befehlen. Mit verklärtem Angesicht schwingt sie sich zum Himmelslicht. Eine leise Ahnung schauert mich aus jenen Welten an. Lange, lange nicht mehr dauert meine Erdenpilgerbahn. Bald hab ich das Ziel errungen, bald zur Heut mich aufgeschwungen. Ernte bald an Gottes Thron meiner Leiden schönen Lohn. Ja, bald, bald meine Leiden schönen Lohn.
Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the second day of the Schiller Institute International Conference entitled All Moral Resources of Humanity Have to be Called Up. Mankind must be the immortal species. Yesterday's discussion, which took place across two panels, took up both the strategic danger looming over all of us with the increasingly deteriorating relations between major nuclear powers of the world, and the related economic dimension, which intersects the dire and extremely urgent situations both in Afghanistan and Haiti. I think the dialogue that took place there was extremely important, extremely productive from the standpoint, especially of moving forward, solutions to this crisis. So I would urge everyone to go back and watch or rewatch those panels and to get active with us. Sign up to become a member of the Schiller Institute, which you can do at the link on your screen or by going to schillerinstitute.com and join us. Help us to come out of this conference with a mobilizing force to put these very important ideas into action. Now, in this third panel today, which is entitled, "There Are No Limits to Growth in the Universe," we'll pick up, in a sense, from where Helga LaRouche left off in her keynote address on panel 1, where she made the point that we human beings are a uniquely creative species. We are not mere earthlings. We're a potentially immortal species in this universe. In contrast to that outlook, a gathering of ghouls in Glasgow just concluded 2 days ago on Friday, the COP26 meeting, at which billionaires, monarchs, bankers, oligarchs, and bureaucrats tried to strong-arm nations of the world into giving up their right to develop, to signing a collective suicide pact. Despite the hullabaloo around it in the media and elsewhere, the agreements didn't come through. China and Russia didn't attend, for example. And more fundamentally, the entire basis of the pseudoscientific claims of uncontrolled global warming is being shown to be completely fraudulent as is the intent behind the policy. So on this panel this morning, or this afternoon, we'll take on both parts of that, the pseudoscience and the political intent. And hopefully, we'll turn our discussion to what the title of our panel points to, the actual nature of mankind in this universe, that there are no limits to growth. So to start us off, our first speaker will be Jason Ross, who is the science advisor to the Schiller Institute. And the title of his presentation is The LaRouche Movement's Role in Defeating Malthusianism.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. The FLOP 26, which just concluded in Glasgow, Scotland, was intended to be the signing of a global suicide pact, in which nations great and small, rich and poor, would commit themselves to energy and other policies that would impoverish and kill their people, prevent new stages of development, and turn over sovereignty from nations to supranational financial and consultancy institutions, operating at the behest of a global oligarchy centered in the City of London and Wall Street, with key assistance from Silicon Valley, Washington, D.C., and other places. But despite the unhinged demands from the Queen of England, from former Bank of England chief Mark Carney, from hapless President Joe Biden, and the conveniently deranged Greta Thunberg, the conference did not succeed in its broadest ambitions. Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin didn't come. Nations such as Nigeria and India absolutely refused to take many actions that would hamstring their ability to grow. Actions such as forswearing the use of coal, of setting aside enormous tracts of land, taking them out of human development, and of committing to certain changes in agriculture and water use that would significantly reduce their potential human populations and living standards. Now, Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche movement have, over decades, built up the intellectual armaments, the historical understanding needed to resist these efforts to instill panic, to rush countries into destroying their livelihoods, and to put forward a positive vision. So where does the push for ineffective energy and this stifling litany of regulations, where does it come from? And how have Lyndon LaRouche and his movement fought it? Now, I'll give you a hint. This push is not from socialism. The Queen of England was not planning to come to the Flop 26 wearing this dress. Tax the rich. She might more likely have appeared in this more modest apparel. Eat the babies. The Bank of England isn't into labor unions, wealth redistribution, or economic progress to lift people out of poverty, although it does support such impotent left ideas as racial essentialism and making an enormous to-do around trans issues, presenting them as of paramount importance. This creates fights that distract people from truly what are the largest issues. But no, this Great Reset, this Build Back Better hogwash, this Green New Deal, this brew of deadly policies does not come from socialism. Lyndon LaRouche and his collaborators have traced out the origins in oligarchism itself. Now, to understand this, LaRouche points to the story of Prometheus, as told by Aeschylus. Prometheus saved the entire human race from absolute destruction by the Olympian god Zeus, by playing a trick on Zeus. Later, Prometheus stole fire itself from heaven and gave it to mankind, creating our species as distinct from all animals, as knowledgeable as the truly human species that we are. Zeus was so enraged that human beings were now raised up towards his level that he condemned Prometheus to perpetual agony and torture for threatening Zeus's identity, which lay in his superiority itself. This is what motivates what we see today as the green policy. These ghouls of Glasgow, the witches and warlocks of the World Economic Forum, the foul specters of sustainability and environmental, social, and governance ESG policies, the royal wraiths, these ill spirits are attempting to create a new supranational elite of finance and bureaucracy that wrest control from national governments, and thereby effecting the regime change that had been announced already at Jackson Hole, Wyoming in August 2019 by BlackRock. The goal? Depopulation, poverty, and maintaining an oligarchical system in which a privileged few live in mastery over increasingly immiserated masses. Consider the August 1988 words of Prince Philip. "In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation." Yes, the Queen's consort believed the world population should be dramatically reduced, with population reduction on a scale far beyond what Hitler sought to achieve. Or take Sir David Attenborough, who, to have a subject for his next video narration, wishes you and your city were eliminated to make room for a majestic slug. And I don't mean the Queen. Attenborough is the patron of Population Matters, whose website enthusiastically says, we can bring about the end of growth sooner and achieve a more sustainable population, but only if we take the action needed now. David Attenborough himself is quoted on the website. "All our environmental problems become easier to solve with fewer people," he says, "and harder and ultimately impossible to solve with ever more people." The goal is depopulation, and it has been pursued for decades. In 1983, Lyndon LaRouche wrote There Are No Limits to Growth, a book that he penned in opposition to the Club of Rome's fraudulent book called The Limits to Growth, which called for limits to development and human population under the argument that mankind was on a development trajectory that would exceed the limited resources available to us. LaRouche wrote There Are No Limits to Growth to set forth his own insights into the relationship between humanity and the natural world. There are no fixed limits to human growth, certainly not any fixed limits that we are anywhere near approaching. Nor are natural resources limited in the way that most people think. Through discovering new physical principles and developing new technologies, new techniques, Our beautiful species expands the repertoire of resources and of power sources available to us, repeatedly overcoming what looked like limits. Forests were saved from overharvesting and destruction, not simply by creating nature reserves, but by developing the use of coal. Coal was able to replace wood for heating. It was able to replace charcoal made from wood and used for making metals. But coal also opened up an entirely new domain of power, the wide-scale adoption and use of the steam engine, which greatly increased the productive powers of human labor and opened for our species an entirely new level of well-being, a new platform. Aluminum, for example, which was once so difficult to produce that Napoleon reportedly ate off of aluminum plates while serving his guests on mere gold, aluminum has, through the creation of the electrical age, become so cheap that we use it to wrap food and throw it away. Nuclear power, whose fuel source embodies per gram not 100 times more than coal or natural gas, not 100 times more than petroleum, but 100, 1,000,000 times more power. This enables enormous efficiencies of land use and of human labor in providing, handling, mining the fuel. So it makes you wonder, where is the support for nuclear power among those expressing supposed concern about a climate catastrophe? Is the goal actually to save the planet? Or is it something else? Is it depopulation? In a 1998 speech, Lyndon LaRouche expressed his view of the relationship between the creative mind, scientific discovery, technological advance, labor productivity, and the higher levels of culture it unlocked.
What the Greeks mean by an idea, and the difference between the archaic art represents a sense perception. The Greek classical art, or the paintings by Raphael or Leonardo da Vinci, represent ideas. There's a difference. One is an image based on the senses, which is what you get on television, isn't it? Television entertainment is based on no ideas but sense perception, blood, violence, and sex. Right? You see it, you feel it, you sense it. That's real. Right? But it's not. Whereas an idea is something else. The term idea means a principle. For example, the common case of a principle is a scientific principle. The idea of gravity. Did you ever see a gravity? Did you ever actually feel one? No, you didn't. You thought you did. You didn't. Did you ever see a principle of nature? You ever shake hands with it? Smell it? Lick it? Touch it? Sniff it? Huh? No, you didn't. But these are ideas, and they are valid, and they tell us something. They tell us the principles that control the universe. Something you can't smell, you can't see, you can't touch, you can't lick it, you can't taste it, and yet it controls the universe. It's called a principle. It's called an idea. All art, great art, is based on ideas, which have nothing to do directly with the senses. Artistic ideas come from contradictions in the senses. As classical art comes from dissonance, from contradictions, from the development of forcing you to find an idea, to find an irony, a metaphor, an idea. Scientific principle, ideas. Now let's look at this. This is where we get to the part about the difference between monkeys and people. Next one. There are 4 steps to forming an idea. And I've reduced it to the form which occurs in science. In science you have, as we have this contradiction, this ontological paradox, this difference between the image of an economy from the standpoint of money, from the standpoint of financial accounting, which is fraudulent. Yeah? But they still collect bills on that basis. Then you have the other concept of the economy, which is based on physical production and things which are essential to physical production, such as education, healthcare, and science services. So you have 2 images of the economy. The fact that the two somehow intersect means that there's an irony here, there's a contradiction, there's a metaphor. And you've got to explain that metaphor to understand how an economy works. Oh, there's another thing. Is that to have a principle in so-called physics, or mathematical physics, called entropy, which says, in effect, that any mechanical system will run down. Now, if an economy is a mechanical system, and all financial accounting is based on mechanics, the principles of mechanical interaction, how can you have a financial system which generates a profit? How can it? Every system, mechanical system, if it continues long enough, runs down. Now, if something runs down, how does it produce more? Every mechanical system always produces less. Therefore, by definition, no economy which corresponds perfectly to a financial accounting system could possibly have a profit. And yet, if we look at the history of mankind, we find that mankind, whose potential population density on this planet, as approximating that of an ape, was only never more than 3 million people on this planet. If mankind were an ape, which is what Prince Philip claims to be, then at no time could there have been more than several million living human individuals on this planet. In the past 2 million years of the Ice Age. At no time. That's the ecological potential of an ape, or an ape-type species. How do we get to several hundred million people, living individuals on this planet, during the medieval period? How do we get to 5 billion people on this planet recently? Obviously, we're not apes. Obviously, we grow. This growth in population depended upon technological progress of various kinds, also artistic progress. Man's increase of power over nature. It depended upon the growth of income, standard of living, lessening morbidity rates. You can't educate a child at the age of 25 if the parents are dying of morbidity rates at the age of 30 or 35, can you? You can't maintain such a society. Therefore, there had to be more, there had to be improvement, there had to be increase. This is no entropic system, this is no mechanical system, this is no financial accounting system. It doesn't explain anything. There's some source of some increase of man's power over nature which intersects the process of production which accounts for this process.
Instead of worshiping nature itself as some new religion, we must increase our power over nature to improve it and ourselves. We must get our noses out of the mud. And instead of looking for ways to literally use bullshit as a fuel source, let's redirect our gaze upwards to the heavens, to the stars, whose power source, nuclear fusion, we must master. And let us look to our friendly moon, which has kindly been collecting in its soil the special isotope helium-3, the perfect fuel source for nuclear fusion, for use here and in space. If you want real solar power, don't collect the feeble light captured from our sun 150 million kilometers away. Recreate that solar power here with nuclear fusion. Use as its fuel helium-3, which is emitted by the sun and far more useful, no offense to plants, than the light that comes from it. The helium-3 emitted by the sun offers us something totally new. So in our future, a generation or two ahead, that future can look back to this moment as the time that we as humanity made a choice to reject once and for all the Malthusian idea of oligarchy. Instead, this is the time boldly to announce that mankind is pursuing the next level of technology, a new level of technology, opening up a domain of living standards and scientific pursuit, a transformation comparable only to the transformation created through the steam engine or the discovery of electromagnetism. From such a future, 2 generations ahead, where there is economic productivity a full order of magnitude, 1,000% beyond our current conditions, looking back from that time, our descendants will be proud of the courage that we showed today.
Thank you very much, Jason, for that I think, important look into who, or maybe better said, what is behind this push on the CO2 fraud. And I think also something which I hope we can take up in the discussion more, Lyndon LaRouche's discoveries of the physical effect of human discovery on the physical universe. Our next speaker is Dr. Augustinus Berkhout in the Netherlands. He is the Emeritus Professor of Geophysics from the Delft University of Technology and a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Berkhout's topic is A Message to the Young People at COP26.
Dear audience, at COP26, filthy rich elites arriving in Glasgow with their 400 private jets lectured our youngsters that their parents and grandparents have caused a global climate crisis by their technological achievements. They also told our youngsters that if they fail to stop this disastrous trend, we all will enter a catastrophe. According to them, it is 5 minutes to midnight to save the planet and humanity. Net zero must be realized immediately. Well, how can these global elites ruin the future of an entire young generation by poisoning them with such a fear-mongering story and by instructing them to destroy everything that has been built by their ancestors? Are these elites modern Don Quixotes, or are they evil idiots? The net result is that we deal with a distressed young generation who have a negative view on science and technology and who believe that they have no future. Thank you, Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, Ursula von der Leyen, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mike Carney, and all the others. Dear audience, let us look at the 7 messages of clientele to our unfortunate kids. Message number 1. Please don't act like a parrot. Be critical against the many false prophets who are trying to take advantage of you and set you up against the impressive progress your parents and grandparents have realized. Bear in mind that the information these prophets tell you is one-sided and misleading. Their information comes from faulty science and wrong model predictions. Message number 2. Deepen your knowledge on the facts of our climate. By doing so, you will discover that there is no evidence that points to a climate crisis. Yes, climate change exists, and it is of all times. But don't worry, the current global warming is gentle, only about 0.14 degrees Celsius per decade. And don't forget, it has already made many, many positive contributions to the quality of life. Message number 3. Do you know that the difference between the mean annual temperature in cold Finland and warm Singapore is more than 20 degrees Celsius? Hear it, 20 degrees Celsius. Yet, both these countries are most successful. Mankind is very clever in adapting to very different climates. Declaring current global warming of 0.14 degrees Celsius per decade a catastrophe is totally out of proportion. Think about that while you're protesting. Message number 4. Did your teachers ever tell you that CO2 is a blessing for everything that lives on our planet? Far from being pollution, CO2 is the molecule of life, providing food for plants. And without plants, there would be very little animal life and no human life at all. Think about that as well while you are protesting. Message number 5. Don't confuse climate change with environmental pollution. They are two completely different phenomena. Climate change is largely caused by the primordial natural forces, and environmental pollution is largely caused by human behavior. Climate change requires clever adaptation measures, and environmental pollution asks for clever clean production technologies. Again, two very different challenges. Don't mix them up. Message number 6. Please don't waste your life by solving a problem that doesn't exist. Instead, put all your talents and energy in developing a productive, sustainable economy. Only then can you realize enough financial means to increase the standard of living beyond the basic needs. When you go back to the unproductive past and make yourself poor, you should be aware that you are no longer in control of your own future. Message number 7. History shows that living on planet Earth requires adaptation all the time. If you continue to advance science and technology, you generate new capabilities to adapt to climate change, to protect our natural environment, to end hunger and poverty, and to create a society where people take care of one another. Intelligent adaptation is the formula for creating a better world. Dear youngsters, why protesting against a problem that doesn't exist? Just adapt. Be aware, more CO2 enables future generations to finally solve the global hunger problem. And be aware that COP26 has become a failure, a total failure, because renewables are a big mistake. I repeat, renewables are a big mistake. They are unreliable and they are unaffordable. 2, the true energy future is the powerful combination of gas and nuclear. Finally, dear youngsters, for all of you who have been poisoned by fear of the future, forget the dodgy preachers of doom and gloom at COP26. They ruin your future by destroying everything your parents and grandparents have built. Don't look at the faulty computer models, but look at the facts. Clintel believes in your capability to make a better world. Consider the 7 challenges in this message as your mission in life.
Thank you, Dr. Berkhout, for that appeal to the reason of the young generation, to the leadership of the young generation. Our next speaker is Professor Sergey Pulinets from Russia. He is at the Space Research Institute at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. His topic is earthquake forecasting at the frontiers of science. And just a heads up to our viewers, we'll see Dr. Pulinets' slides. We will get a chance to see him after the slides are over. So please, Professor Pulinets, go ahead.
Okay. Hello to everybody. Thanks to organizers to inviting me. I have connection with Schiller movement more than 10 years and sometimes participated in conferences, and I consider that now it is very important moment when we should think about the major problems of humanity. And one of these problems is the earthquake prediction. Why, for more than 100 years, science cannot resolve this problem? I will try to explain you what is happening now. If you look on the traditional presentation, how the earthquakes are generated, is called seismogenesis. Classical view is that we have the continuous movement of the tectonic plates which are colliding or move in different directions, which creates the compression, stretching, deformation, and when this deformation reaches the limits of stress resistance, we have the rupture, and which called the earthquake. There are several relative movements of the tectonic blocks, which are called the faulting, active faults, which is normal faulting, reverse faulting, strike slip faulting. For example, in California, what you have, the plates are moving like a strike. And idea of the earthquake prediction in the 70s of the last century was that when you store the stress and come to limit, then after that again you store and repeat it, and you can calculate this time and predict the earthquakes. There was a physical model, physical presentation, how it works. The period between previous and next earthquake was divided by several stages when the small irregularity is formed, that the stress is increasing, and we come from the to the stage when we have disruption of the crust, and this is a final stage of the earthquake preparation. And there was developed together in United States and in Soviet Union the models which demonstrated different physical parameters which have their dynamics during the phase of the earthquake preparation, such as radon release, the level of groundwater, electrical resistivity, velocity of seismic waves, and the seismologists were optimistic that they would be able to predict the earthquakes. And one of the examples was the experiment in Parkfield, where the earthquakes happens something like 30-something years during successfully more than century. And next earthquake was expected in 1993 and did not happen. It happened more than 10 years later on the 28th September of 2004. And this case was accepted by seismologists as tragedy. They decided that all the precursors cannot work. And finally, in 1997, it was published the paper which was called "Earthquakes Cannot Be Predicted." There were seismologists from Japan, Robert Geller from United States, David Jackson, Jan Kagan, and so on. And they claimed that as the obvious ideas have been tried and rejected for over 100 years, so there is no necessary to work further for predictions, that short-term prediction is impossible. This was founded by the such work which became the Bible of seismology, written by Beck, How Nature Works. And it said that we are in chaos, and every irregularity in the region can develop into the future earthquake, and we cannot say what kind and where this irregularity is, and so we cannot predict the earthquakes. This process is called self-organized criticality, that nature is self-organizes, but we don't know how it happens, and we cannot predict the earthquakes. And there was a period when the even mention the words of the earthquake prediction was prohibited. The paper were not published, and people were even punished for the publication of the papers on the earthquake prediction. What is the modern state of seismology now? There exists the long-term and middle-term prediction, which is based only on the seismic catalogs. So seismology left behind them the old physics and use only the statistics. The physicists in seismology were replaced by mathematicians, which calculate the possibility, the probability of future earthquake using the catalog and history of previous earthquake to estimate the probability of earthquake in the next few years and next few months. But what will happen in next few days, what we name the short-term prediction, is not used in seismology now. And in this stage, it looks like, that like a mink which make you diagnostic of your health by the heart rate measured in wrist. That's all. But we have many other things, and step by step, the physicists, which are majority of them are not seismologists, started to look how this process is developing and what happens in the last stage when the short-term precursors are generated. We developed the physical model which can explain the many kinds of atmospheric and ionospheric anomalies which appear not under the ground but in atmosphere and ionosphere and can be monitored by remote sensing by the satellite. The history of these studies was very long. You can see the first publication starting our models was 1991, and almost 30 years passed that we came the conclusion that we able to predict the earthquakes. So in the left part you can see the physical model. Every square on this picture needs a special lecture, so I will not stop on the physical model and only say that to get conclusion of the possibility of earthquakes, we should monitor using the satellite ground-based measurements, and we call this that system for pre-earthquake signal detection, utilization, and alerts. Very simple. There are two major precursors which are could be used for short-term prediction. It is a thermal prediction and electromagnetic, mainly ionospheric precursors, from where we take the heat. Before the earthquakes, in the active tectonic faults, radon is released, and new formed ions are very good centers for condensation of water vapor, which always is in the air, and condensation or condensating on ions, water release so-called the latent heat. And these fluxes of latent heat are huge. The effectiveness of this process is 10 power 10. It is compared with a nuclear explosion. For example, before the strongest earthquake like Sumatra or Tohoku earthquake, the quantity of the thermal energy released for few days before the earthquakes was order of magnitude larger than the energy of the earthquake itself. And they formed new ions which create the so-called ion clusters, reduce the air conductivity, and this leads to the formation of large-scale anomalies in the ionosphere. All of this appears few days before the earthquake. I will show you examples of these precursors using the L'Aquila earthquake as example. First, we can monitor the size of the area of the earthquake preparation from the space. This yellow and red spots shows the thermal anomalies in the area of the earthquake preparation. This is the aquila. And from the size of this area, we can determine the magnitude of the future earthquake. Then the heats go up. We see it in atmosphere, in the middle atmosphere, in the top of the clouds, and in the ionosphere. And very interesting is behavior of the ionosphere. The appearance of the precursors looks like the stalactites and stalagmites, and these precursors appears on the fixed time, something like from 1 to 10 days before the earthquakes. So using these precursors, we can estimate the time of the earthquake. Using the size of the anomaly occupying the area, we can estimate the magnitude, and center of this area shows the position of the epicenter. All these processes before earthquake developed exponentially. They concentrate in the short period, and we can detect this process from the acceleration of different precursors and their development. This is how looks the ionospheric precursor. In the vertical axis, it is a local time. In the horizontal axis, it's days. So during nighttime, here after the sunset, appears the positive anomaly which lasts through the night to the sunrise. And this positive anomaly is very stable precursor which indicates the approaching earthquakes. Here you can see several examples. Is a Tohoku earthquake. This is a Rich Christ earthquake. This is a Hector mine earthquake in California. And the stability of these precursors can be demonstrated by two examples. Two earthquakes with the same magnitude, 7.1, happened in the distance of 20 years. First was the Hector mine earthquake, second was Ridge Christ earthquake, which happened more or less in the same area of California. And you can see that these nighttime positive anomalies ionosphere are registered, and then they are very similar for the Hector mine and for Ridge Christ. So it is a stable precursor which can be registered regularly. And this is a area of the Ridge Christ earthquake, and this is a thermal anomaly. This is the epicenter. You can see the thermal anomaly which is inside the area of preparation from which we can estimate the magnitude and the epicenter position. This is a California earthquake with magnitude 5.5, and this is a demonstration how different precursors are concentrated close to the time of the earthquake, and we see acceleration of the process. These are the two earthquakes in Nepal, one of the 25th of April 2015, second one on 5th of May 2015. Both of them are with magnitude more than 7. And this permits us to organize the automatic identification of the precursors using the set of the parameters which we get from the remote sensing, and by the special processing we can automatically identify the precursors and to make the short-term forecast. This is an example what we now are doing in the Kamchatka area. These red spots other earthquakes. Circles determine the area of the earthquake preparation and automatically the magnitude. And all this gives us possibility to make the predictions in the Kamchatka area. This is one of the examples. You can see one circle is the automatically detection, second one is detection of the operator working, and this is a very close position of epicenters detected automatically and real position of the epicenter of the earthquake. So I will finish with the conclusion that the seismic tectonic processes work as an open, non-equilibrium system with dissipation, which is described by synergetics. We observe the explosive growth of some parameters magnitude. It's called the exacerbation mode and precursors acceleration. We observe this for all the types of the earthquakes. The created physical model provides comprehensive explanation of the precursors generation process. So we understand what is happening. We don't register some things that we do not understand, level of the water, something like this. All the precursors we register, we have physical mechanism explanation how they are generated. And now we, but many of things we are demonstrating are not fully accepted by seismologists. And urgently, practically, they neglect everything which was done by their fathers and grandfathers, as you heard in the previous presentation. We should turn them back to the physics to see that not only the crust, not only underground processes, but atmosphere and near Earth environment give us signals, give us information on the future earthquake. And we already created the applications which could be used in the real prediction. And in case of the official implementation, it gives opportunity to solve one of the main problems of mankind and realize the short-term earthquake forecast. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Pulinets. I think what you...
Now
Oh, we get to see you now. Wonderful. The man behind the voice. So thank you very much. I think we'll have a chance to discuss this more in the Q&A, I hope, but I think you've shown us not just the damage of turning science over to pure mathematics, the mathematicians, but also a very concrete and exciting example of mankind surmounting the problems of nature through discovery. So thank you very much. Okay. Our next speaker is Professor Karl Otto Weiss, PhD from Germany, who is the former director and professor at the German Principal Institute of Metrology in Braunschweig, Germany. And his topic is on sustainability.
First, I would like to thank the organizers of the meeting to give me an opportunity to give my view on this phenomenon, which is called sustainability, which is much cited these days. What we hear every day on the media is the raw materials are finite. Already in May, we have exceeded the limits for consumption of the year. We have only one Earth, the limits of growth, the climate catastrophe, and followed by a pandemic, etc., etc. This is the sound of the media day after day, and all seem to believe it and hold it up as non-deniable arguments in discussion. We cannot continue like this. We have to cut back on our consumption, develop a sustainable life mode. If not, the earth will be burning and the end of humankind is threatening. Already in 1990, our then Minister of Environment, Angela Merkel, decreed, if we do not reduce immediately and sharply our CO2 emissions, the Earth will be uninhabitable by 2020. As we all know, the CO2 emissions have grown since then exponentially. Now, how is this sustainable lifestyle to be practiced? The politicians are increasingly clear about this. They say without massive, painful limitations of our living standards, it will not be possible, and the economists find the planned Green Deal of the European Union will not be feasible without an eco-dictatorship. But the question is this historical claim, going back to Malthus, again and again maintained and always falsified by reality, is it correct at all? The Stone Age did not end because of the shortage of stones, stated Saudi oil minister Yamani. But why did it end? Because something better had been invented. In this case, an artificial alloy of copper and tin, which is called bronze, and which had shown itself to be much better suited for making tools, etc., much better suited than the good old stone material. The fundamental property of all organic life is its faculty to continually unlock new methods for survival. And for this, there are no limitations. This is not where we have only one Earth. This faculty of unlocking new methods for survival can be observed even at a very early stage of life. 4 billion years ago, cyanoalgae developed as the first primitive form of life. And for their survival and self-replication, they converted CO2, of which the atmosphere consisted then largely, to carbohydrates and to oxygen, as do all plants. 2 billion years ago, most of the CO2 was used up. What would have happened if a sustainability advocate would have been present? One would have concluded the resources for our life are limited. Moreover, the oxygen produced is poisonous for the algae. Chemically, it is similar to chlorine, which is known to be poisonous. And consequently, we have to reduce our consumption so that at least a small fraction of our species can survive. So that would have been the view of sustainability advocate. But what happened in reality? A new species surfaced, which consumes the poisonous oxygen and converts it to CO2. Flora was joined by fauna, and a wonderful circle came into being. Flora converts CO2 and sunlight into carbohydrates and oxygen, which constitutes the food for fauna, which burns the carbohydrates with the oxygen and thus provides again the food for flora. And in this way, a never-ending circle was established, which guarantees the survival of flora and fauna infinitely and without any limitation. So this shortage catastrophe, which could be expected for the algae, did not happen because, again, something better had been invented. The same happened at the transition of the hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies. Hunting and gathering fed a small population. Agriculture did not originate because of any shortage for the hunter-gatherer societies, but simply again because it could better for instance, more predictably feed the populations, and the populations then grew immensely. Again, something better had been invented. Even after this, however, the life elixir energy was limited to the availability of plant carbohydrates. Small amounts of energy were provided by wind and water, and these were the limits of natural resources. This came to change only about 2 centuries ago, as it was discovered that fire can accomplish human labor, for instance by the steam engine. The following further development of machine engine techniques led then to an unheard of increase of the standard of living and an increase of the populations. While before industrialization, 90% of the population lived on the edge of starvation, after industrialization, only about 10% of the then much increased population suffer from hunger today. This invention, again, was no reaction to some scarcity or shortage. To the previous mode of work, another, better one had been invented. Again, presently our energy supply is based on coal, gas and oil, which for a long time reaches no limits. The institution, which is charged in Germany with monitoring the energy resources, which is BGR in Hanover, Germany, states a comfortable situation. The known reserve lasts for more than 1,000 years, while 90% of the presumed resources have not even been investigated. The Club of Rome predicted during the 1960s, based on its model calculations, by 2030 a complete exhaustion of all carbon sources. That means coal, gas and oil. And I should mention this, ironically, they proved with this that a climate catastrophe due to CO2 will never occur. In reality, now the known reserves are larger today than in the 1960s. Even though there is no shortage of energy now, the next better is already a reality, namely the access to the energy stored in nuclei. With this, energy for millions of years is available by nuclear fission alone, not to talk about nuclear fusion, but other problems also become solvable. For instance, energy storage. Current energy storage, for instance, in batteries, relies on the energy stored in the electron shell of the atoms. The corresponding energies stored in the nuclei are 1 billion times larger. The energy for moving a car during its lifetime would then be stored in a matchbox. The supply of raw materials is also not finite. They can always be recycled. They correspond to chemical catalysts, which facilitate the process, but are never used up in the process. Of course, recycling requires energy, but there's apparently no shortage of that. If I speculate about future inventions, who says that in a foreseeable future our food could not be synthesized from water, CO2 and a few trace elements, but eliminating the need to kill animals for our survival. The most powerful supply of energy might come from annihilation of matter with antimatter, although at present the current view is that a symmetry breaking in the early universe has destroyed all antimatter, but it has never been considered that domains of antimatter could have isolated themselves in a solitron-like fashion. Thus, again, such a speculative thing might not be impossible. Okay, so we understand that shortages and the Malthusian idea of scarcity is not really reality. But then comes another objection from the sustainability advocates. The climate crisis due to CO2 and all the other publicized dangers and crises. That will necessitate the impoverishment and the reduction of the populations. On the contrary, every person familiar with the scientific literature knows more than 2,500 research works have been published, which show, based on measurements, that the role of CO2 for the climate is small and negligible. Zero works, on the other hand, exist, which can prove by measurements any essential influence of CO2 on Earth's climate. Earth's climate is determined by and large by the three principal solar activity cycles. The climate crisis is a media creation based on the certainty that the average citizen will not read the scientific literature. All other alleged dangers are equally media creations. In short, the claim of necessity to reduce living standards has no basis. A closer look reveals that this claim intends to impoverish and reduce the populations to a rest of gene-manipulated labor slaves and to stop any technical progress, because that might endanger the rule of the often cited 0.1%, who intend to create a steady state of society which would guarantee their eternal rule. The concept of sustainability is foreign to organic life. The inexhaustible resource of human inventiveness is the means to guarantee a material paradise even for growing populations. As an illustration, I would like to cite a few lines from a novel with the title Halbschatten, which means half shadow, which is about the life of a German pioneering woman aviator. So the text goes like this: the propeller, this highly complicated, complex form, perfect in itself, is the wonderful discovery which, together with the engine and the wings, accomplishes the impossible, flying. Visible sign that man can grow beyond oneself. Be fruitful and master the earth, says the Bible. The human being is not limited. Everything is open to him, the sky, the water, and the earth. So nobody should let ignorant or corrupted politicians, corrupted media, and corrupted scientists let themselves tell that you have to live in property and deny creativity and inventiveness. So with this appeal, I conclude my little lecture and thank for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Weiss. What you said about sustainability being a concept foreign to life, I think, is extremely important. This is backed up by the work of Vernadsky, among others, so perhaps we can take that up in our discussion. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Kelvin Kemm from South Africa. He's a nuclear physicist and the former chairman of the South African Nuclear Energy Corporation. Dr. Kemm's topic is a COP26 postmortem, End Eco-colonialism Through Climate Truth.
Energy is the lifeblood of a country. Being the lifeblood of a country, it must flow all of the time to keep the country alive. Let's just put that thought aside for a moment. Africa is huge. It is completely different to Europe. When looking at solutions of anything that work in Europe, it doesn't mean they're going to work in Africa. Put that thought aside for a moment. Let us have a look at this climate story. This whole climate thing, ask yourself, is it true? Is this really happening? We hear all the time, oh, scientists say, but by far the majority of people that I come across who prepare to say the scientists say have found their information out of a populist magazine, out of a newspaper, or off TV. Virtually nobody has read an actual scientific article. So what is going on? Is this true? Let us have a quick look. Has there been warming? The answer is yes. There has been warming about 1 degree Celsius since the time that Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States. Is this linked to carbon dioxide? The answer is probably no. It's exceedingly doubtful. Certainly, if you go back to the time when the Earth was born, when it was a molten lump of lava and everything came about in time. Carbon dioxide developed in such a way that it held heat in from the sun. That's absolutely true. As a result, the world became warm enough to sustain human life. And that has been the case now for a long, long time. And as a result, all life developed. Had there been no greenhouse effect, life probably would never have evolved on the earth at all. So thank heavens that there is a greenhouse effect. So now we say, is it the case that the extra carbon dioxide that industry has put into the atmosphere since the time of Abraham Lincoln, which was about the same time as the Crimean War, can that be the issue? The answer is almost certainly no. Even, is there an enhanced global warming? Is there more global warming taking place now than there was, say, a century ago or whatever? The answer is probably not really, not much. And is it the result of human activity? The answer is no. The human activity is so negligible that it really is pushing the limits of believability to think that that is what is causing supposedly this climate change thing. So now we say, is there a climate crisis? The answer is absolutely no. There's no crisis that we have to react next week and the month after and so on. But then people say to me at social events, but the scientists say, and you say, but where have you heard that from? And you say, have you heard any opposing views? Well, not really, you see, only a few deniers here and there. The word deniers is taken like from the Spanish Inquisition, where anybody who stepped out of line was hammered by the authorities. Where are the opponents given opportunity to talk? The answer is largely they're suppressed by the media. They are victimized, they're hounded, and I'm not joking. I know of prominent, credible scientists that have been forced to leave their jobs, that have been hounded out of events and so on, because they dare to say, maybe this is not true. Maybe there's more to this than going on. So what happens is we get this COP26 that takes place in Glasgow just a few days ago. Quite frankly, what came out of COP26 is a lot of hot air, excuse the pun, but here we have 400 private jets flying into Glasgow so those people can meet to tell me why I mustn't fly in aeroplanes if I can possibly help it, and why you mustn't drive a big motor car and such like. Now, I was very pleased to see President Emmanuel Macron of France a few days ago announcing that he intends to push for more nuclear and that he intends to initiate a small modular program there as well. In fact, a number of world leaders have said that recently, that nuclear is the answer. That's one of the positive things that came out of COP26. When people sat down and looked at the reality and said, can the world actually run on wind and solar power and batteries and hydrogen and so on? The batteries and the hydrogen are brought about because the wind is so variable and there's no sunlight at night that you have to somehow store that wind and solar energy somewhere so that you can use it in the dark and when the wind's not blowing. So you come up with batteries and you come up with hydrogen and so on. But to be able to store the amount of energy you want, you would have a much bigger system than you started with, not just double or triple, even bigger than that. So you would have massive wind turbine farms, massive solar arrays, and so on and so forth. And solar can be damaged with high winds and hail and all sorts of other things. So it's not at all secure. It's not this magic bullet that has been projected in the media to such a degree. And then when somebody stands up and says, but nuclear is an option, then you get hammered and you get hate mail and so on and so forth. So a number of people and newspapers and magazines and so on, just before COP26 and now after COP26, have said, when you sit down and carefully look at reality and actually become realistic, you discover that we cannot run the world on wind and solar. And bear in mind, the wind and solar came about because of the climate argument that the climate was as a result of carbon dioxide. But in fact, basic physics tells you that it's probably the temperature and the carbon dioxide is quite likely the other way around. That the temperature goes up first And then, in fact, the carbon dioxide comes afterwards and not how you've been told. Those of you who have these soda stream machines in your kitchen that you can make your own soda water at home will probably know that you're told to put the bottles of water in the refrigerator to make them cold, because the cold water sucks up much more carbon dioxide gas than warm water does. Now, if the Earth's oceans are cold, it'll have more carbon dioxide gas in. If the temperature then starts to rise, the planet starts to get warmer, it'll emit that carbon dioxide. So there's this distinct possibility that the carbon dioxide has come about as a result of the temperature rise, and the carbon dioxide is then being emitted. And why might the temperature rise? And an answer is the solar cycle. If you look at the sun, you will find the sun goes through regular cycles. There's an 11-year cycle where the sun goes from a minimum to a maximum. It goes up and down like this. The heat from the sun is not enough to warm the planet to the amount required. So often people who want to shoot down that argument say, no, the sun doesn't get hotter enough to make the Earth hotter. It's not the heat, it's the magnetic field. The magnetic field interacts with the Earth's magnetic field and creates a screen around the Earth for incoming nuclear particles from deep space. The incoming nuclear particles from deep space nucleate clouds, just like the jet streams that you see behind high-flying aircraft. So the nuclear particles could come in and increase or decrease the cloud cover, depending on whether there's a stronger or weaker magnetic field around the Earth. The cloud cover can distinctly change the amount of heat reaching the ground, and therefore the amount of heat that is being absorbed there, and therefore the carbon dioxide that's being emitted from the oceans, for example. It's also well known that with more CO2, plants are growing wonderfully. There's an absolute measured increase in greenness on the planet, in the sense of much more green stuff has been growing over the last number of years as a result of the increased CO2. You'll also look back in history, you will find there were previous global warming periods. The medieval warm period, you can look it up in the history records, the Roman warming, the Minoan warming, exactly the same sort of thing that has happened recently. They were followed by super cold periods in sync with the sun. During the time of Shakespeare, which is about the time that the Pilgrim Fathers arrived in the United States, there was what was known as the Little Ice Age. It plunged into super cold temperatures. The Thames froze over to the degree at which an elephant actually walked across the Thames, and horse-drawn coaches used to ride down the Thames. It was since then that there's been another warming that has resulted in this, up till now, this 1 degree rise from the middle 1600s through to when the warming has started to become evident as against the cool period, which was at the time of Abraham Lincoln. So why do people want to blame warming on industry, on man-made, known as anthropogenic carbon dioxide? The answer is it's quite likely wrong. So this ridiculous panic that is setting in, screaming climate crisis and so on, numbers of politicians just to get attention, comes up at COP26, which results in more colonial-style bullying, telling us what to do at the expense of the growth of our country and the growth of our people and the rest of Africa and other parts of the world. You cannot do that. This is wrong. You've got to be much more honest with yourself to find out what is the actual truth, what is really happening. And my feeling is that this whole climate thing is probably wrong. There has been some warming. Yes, it's probably linked to the solar cycle. It's probably beneficial. It's not a problem. It'll, just like happened in the past, will not cause harm. In fact, if you look back historically, the warming periods like the medieval warm period, Roman warming, and so on, all coincided with periods of health, welfare, and growth in the countries of the world. It was the cold periods when the potatoes failed in Ireland, causing many Irish to go to what is now the United States. It was the cold periods when famine broke out and disease broke out. So it was the cold periods, which is logical. That's when the rains came and it was dark and cold and so on. So cold was associated with famine and disease and so on. The warmth has been associated with health and welfare. So we really shouldn't be panicking and forcing the vulnerable countries of the world to toe the line of some mythical image that is created in Europe and elsewhere. Let's be realistic. Let's have a look at this thing and say, let's be honest, and let's help all of mankind to progress and benefit in a spirit of collaboration.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Kemm. Not only for pointing to the colonial intention behind the panic, the induced panic, but also the benefits of the natural warm period, which I appreciate. Our next speaker is State Senator Mike Thompson from the United States. Senator Thompson is a Kansas state senator. He's the chairman of the Senate Utilities Committee. And his topic is Stop the Weaponization of Science.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you. I guess I don't know if this is morning or not when we're doing this. This is morning when I'm recording this, and I wish I could be there with everyone live to talk about this topic. It's extremely important, and we just learned on Friday, last Friday, that the production tax credits for this renewable energy will be extended to 2034. We thought that they would end in 2020, then they got extended to 2021, and now, of course, as part of the $1.2 trillion package infrastructure, quote unquote, bill, they're extending the production tax credits. Was not a surprise. I never expected those to end. Unfortunately, what that does is continues to undermine our grid reliability, increase our electrical costs, and long-term ensure that we're going to have malinvestment into renewables, which really don't work. As you well know, from the last Arctic outbreak in February, both here in Kansas and also down in Texas, it was a massive failure. The wind companies all say that they were the big winners, that they outperformed. But in Kansas, it dropped almost no wind production at all. I'm not sure how they call that a wind. And of course, in Texas, we had hundreds of people who died. Millions were out of power, and some for more than a week because of the lack of renewable energy that ERCOT, the Texas grid, has become extremely reliant on, unfortunately. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk just a little tiny bit about the weaponization of science, and that's something I've been acutely aware of for quite some time. I'll preface it by saying I long thought that by engaging with a scientific discussion with these people who are extremely disingenuous, that we actually legitimize their science, that the climate is going to be at a tipping point at a certain time, and it's going to be irreversible. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is utilizing fear, as they always do, to motivate people into action. And that's what we saw in Glasgow, Scotland, even though all these people from all over the world flew in their 400 jets into this place. It's all about control. It's all about money and power. It has nothing to do with science. And it's something that's been going on for a very, very long time. The weaponization of the term science, to use it as a political cudgel to motivate people into doing things or to force them into things. And now we really are at a tipping point for sanity in this country. We've got ESG standards, environmental, social, and governance standards, which are being imposed by financial institutions and forcing companies to invest in renewable energy, even though it does not work and it's not green or at all. And so let me just kind of walk you through what has happened. Back in 1997, I was invited to the White House, and Al Gore had invited 100 meteorologists from around the country to listen to his presentation on carbon dioxide and the massive amounts of CO2 that we're pumping into the atmosphere and causing climate change. The intent of that was not really to promote science, but to promote this narrative, this so-called science narrative, so that the meteorologists who attended would be proselytized and returned to their home markets and preach the gospel of climate change across the country. Well, it worked for most of them. I did not do it, but a lot of them did. A lot of them bought it, and that began the steady drumbeat in 1997 of this climate change narrative, soundbite science that we've been utilizing for years and years and years. And they do several things very effectively. One is conflate climate and environment. They tell people basically, you're putting all this stuff into the air and it's going to change the climate. Well, sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, all these gases, all these different things that we have been putting into the air over the course of time can pollute the environment, but they cannot change the climate. Fortunately, we've done a great job of cleaning up the climate, or cleaning up the environment, but it doesn't matter if we didn't. It would still get cold in the winter, still get hot in the summer, because our climate is driven primarily by the sun and not by anything in the atmosphere. In fact, carbon dioxide is beneficial. We have cleaned up the environment and we do a very, very good job. They always point to China as, being one of the great offenders, and they are building a lot of coal plants, about one a week, because they're smart and they see they need energy. And we're going the opposite direction, unfortunately. But putting CO2 into the atmosphere at this point does nothing. We've reached total saturation. CO2 does not blanket the entire Earth. In fact, if you look at a CO2 map of the Earth, you'll see that there are pockets where there's CO2, but there's vast expanses of the Earth where the CO2 levels are very, very, very low as compared to other areas. In addition to that, carbon dioxide does not absorb the entire infrared spectrum. It's sort of like putting a fishnet over the Earth. It only absorbs very specific infrared radiation lines. Those lines are already absorbed. We already have enough CO2 to absorb those specific portions of the infrared spectrum that carbon dioxide can do. So, in other words, we could double, triple, or quadruple the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere right now, and it would have no impact on the temperature, no impact on the climate whatsoever. Water vapor still is the primary driver, and always has been the primary driver of stabilizing the temperature of this planet. It slows down the outgoing long-wave radiation just enough to give us a livable temperature on this planet. Same thing happens for carbon dioxide. And once that infrared radiation reaches a different point of entropy, it still is released back out into outer space. We don't trap that energy. It eventually makes its way back to outer space. So that is one thing we conflate, is climate and the environment. We also conflate weather and climate. Weather is short-term. Weather patterns are short-term. And by short-term, I don't mean just today or tomorrow. You can have weather patterns that can persist for quite some time, months on end, in fact. And a lot of that's driven by ocean temperatures and how that forms the low pressure areas and where they're anchored. And that has a huge determination on the weather pattern that you see repeated across any one area of the Earth over time. Climate is long term. These people who say that, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that we have less than 12 years to live if we don't do something about the climate. She has no concept of what climate is. It takes thousands of years for the climate to change. The Milankovitch cycle, there are 3 specific cycles within that determine how the Earth and the sun's relationship changes over time. And some of these cycles last for 100,000 years. The ellipticity, for example, how the Earth rotates around the sun, we're closer to a not a sphere right now, a spheric orbit right now, but we're fairly close to it. And over time, that ellipticity grows. So when we're farther from the sun over the course of that change in that cycle, we're much farther from the sun. And so we get less of the solar radiation. So you get a combination of the ellipticity change and solar cycles themselves changing, where you get the magnetic flux in the sun quieting down. Then you get into a situation where the Earth cools off. It's all part of a natural cycle. The Earth's tilt changes with time, and also which hemisphere is pointed toward the sun during the winter and the summer also changes. Those cycles vary from 20,000 years to 100,000 years. So there's nothing man can do about these cycles, but it is what drives the climate of this planet. That and the internal engine of the sun itself, the magnetic changes in the sun, and the rotation of the larger planets in our solar system have centripetal force on the sun that changes how the internal dynamics of the sun happens. I'm not a solar physicist by any stretch of the imagination, but I understand how this all changes. And to say that carbon dioxide is the primary driver of climate change is so ignorant and so malinformed that it just doesn't make any sense. And unfortunately, that's what the public has been fed over years. I see I'm pretty rapidly approaching the end of my time. Sorry, I couldn't get my PowerPoint going, but basically I covered all of that. And basically, a lot of what we've been discussing with climate change has been the impetus for our energy change. Horrible energy policy changes in the United States, away from reliable, cheap electricity toward expensive, unreliable electricity, and we're going to pay for it. And I think the United Kingdom is already doing that. You see how the gas prices have gone up, how the coal plants are being retired. So we are in deep, deep trouble if we don't realize that and start fighting back.
Thank you very much, Senator Thompson. It's a relief, frankly, to be able to talk through some of the real effects of solar system cycles and other physical cycles on the Earth's climate. It really is a fascinating science when the hysteria lets you really discuss it. So thank you for introducing that topic. Our next speaker, who I think may elaborate further on that topic, is Professor Franco Battaglia in Italy. Professor Battaglia is a professor of physical chemistry at the University of Modena. He's a member of the initiating committee of the Petition on Anthropogenic Global Warming of June 2019. And the title of his speech is Nobel Winners' Climate Models Are Wrong.
Good morning. I'm Franco Battaglia. I'm a professor of chemical physics at the University of Modena, Italy. Actually, since a few months, I'm retired. I have written a short book, which is called, you can show the first slide, please. There is no climate emergency. The petition sent to the United Nations by 1,000 world scientists. And first signatory is Ivar, physics Nobel laureate. Now, this small book comes from a petition, actually, which has been organized by Clintel, which was sent to the Secretary of the United Nations, and the petition says what it says in the title. In the small book, which is available at Amazon, I explain the scientific reasons for why there is no climate emergency. So, in fact, I explain in detail the reasons of the petition itself. Now, as we know, we have all been told that there is a climate crisis, and since a few years ago, they have have said that after all, even a Nobel Prize was given for that, except that it was a Nobel Prize for peace, not for science. So that was a quite easy criticism to do. Now this year, a Nobel Prize in physics has been given for two scientists, excellent scientists, I must say, Manabe and Wasserman, because they have worked on climate models, and according to the Nobel Prize Committee, they have proved that the present climate change, the present global warming, is due to human activities. Now, in my book, which came out in Italian, in the Italian version in September, I wrote that there was a mistake in the interpretation of scientific results, which shouldn't have been made. In the English edition of the book, which came out after the Nobel Prize, I pointed out that the Nobel Prize Committee has made exactly the mistake that I have warned not to make. So if we can show in the second slide what is the picture which appeared in the appears in the book. As you see, in the black line here shows the real climate, the one which is experimentally observed. Now, the models that use the natural forcing, the natural forces, display a result which is shown in the blue line, which is apparently not in agreement with the black line. I mean, is not in agreement with the experimental data. When in the models I introduced also human forces, the results from the model are in the pink line, which apparently seems to be in agreement with the results. So they said the conclusion has been that the models are validated and that humans are responsible almost 100% for the present global warming since IPCC says since the middle of 20th century. Now, as I will explain, even this sentence is wrong. However, why this interpretation is not correct? The reason why this interpretation is not correct, and indeed, if we see in the next slide, slide number 3 here. This is the slide shown in the press release from the Nobel Prize Committee of this year. Again, we see the black line, which are the experimental results, the blue line, which are the models without human forces, and the red line, which are the results from the models with human forces. And they say what I said before, that the model seems to be validated and the humans are responsible for the warming. Now, where is the mistake? Where is the great mistake? The great mistake is that the reason why the models appear to be not in agreement with the experiment is not because there are no natural, there are not included human forces, but because the models are plainly wrong. This could be. Now, and that the red line, which seems to be in agreement with the natural, with the experiments, with the real climate, is actually an artifact due to the fact that the mistake has been corrected ad hoc just to show, to get the agreement with the experiments. How can we solve this this conundrum? I mean, how do we know? How could we know whether the models are wrong? The models are not in agreement with the experiments because they are wrong, or because they do not include human forces. The only way to do is to see whether the models are able to be in agreement with the climate in the past, when there was no there were no human forcings. Are these models in agreement with the climate in the past? Well, the answer is no, because when the models are used to produce the climate in the past, they do not produce the optimum climate in the Holocene. They do not produce the Roman warming. They do not produce the medieval warming. So the models are indeed wrong. Also, the models have predicted for the 20 years between 2000 and today a warming which is half degree higher than the experimental warming. So they do not even, so they fail in reproducing the time pattern of the warming, and also they fail to reproduce the space pattern on the warming. How? Well, because the models predict that at around 10 kilometers above in the equatorial troposphere, it should be observed what is called a hot spot, where the increasing in temperature should be at least 3 times higher than the increase in temperature on the ground level. However, this is not the prediction from the models. However, when measurement up there in the troposphere, around at 10 kilometers above the equator, when the temperatures are measured by thermometers on satellites or balloon, up there is observed not an even greater temperature increase, not to mention triple increase, but it is observed a lower temperature than in the ground. So therefore these models are wrong. So apparently the Nobel Prize, which was given to the 2 scientists, which are great scientists, they have tackled the most complex system among the complex systems that could be studied, which is the climate system. So they have done an excellent job, but those models are not yet right enough. We must be we should consider that the variation in temperatures we are talking about are variations in temperature of the order of 1 degree, whereas the temperature, the variation in temperature, the natural variation in temperature could be of the order of 10 or 12 degrees between a glacial air and a interglacial times. So what can we say now? Well, we can say that the main reason why there is no climate emergency, at least when we say climate emergency, there is no climate emergency due to CO2 emissions, is because there are no scientific results who can support this claim. Obviously, climate can change in the sense, meaning that weather can change. And the only thing that humans could do to protect themselves from severe weather events is to adapt. It is quite pointless to think that we can change the climate. It is as if to protect oneself from the snow, to protect a house from in the mountain from the snow, instead than spending money to build ceilings which are not flat, one spends money to avoid snow up in the mountain. So this is the major message I would like to send with this the time that has been given to me. So in the small book there are more details, better explained than I could do now in the small time that I have. And I thank you very much for having invited me.
Thank you very much, Professor Battaglia. I think all of the things you said, but in particular, the pointing out that these models that are used to claim that we have unprecedented warming are wrong. They're wrong. They don't actually predict the climate at all. It's a very important point that should be made repeatedly. So we're now at the end of our speeches, and we're moving into our question and answer period. So we have, I think, most of the speakers that you heard ready to take your questions. I would just urge anyone who would like to ask a question, you can send it in to questions@schillerinstitute.org. So a lot, I think, has been put on the table by our speakers, from the fraud of the panic around climate change, to the real science of climate, to the role of youth, and the capabilities of the human mind in this universe more generally. We've had already several questions come in, which I'll be posing in a moment. But before we do that, I want to bring up someone who's on with us who I would like to have, who would like to ask a question or maybe make a comment. This is Mr. Adrian Badescu, who is from Romania. He's the former advisor to the Prime Minister on infrastructure and the president of the Group for the Promotion of Infrastructure in Romania. So welcome. Hello.
Hello, and thank you for the invite. As a short debatable question, I mean, as we see it, I'm a sociologist, so I'll try to look from my point of view. Is the manipulation used by scientists, as we've seen it in the pandemic, also it is used to make us use the Green Deal, and because in my country and in a lot of Southeastern European countries, they're like forcing us to make a lot of Green Deal, to put a lot of Green Deal ideas in our governmental programs, and for us to have access to the European Union funds. And I see it as a sociologist, the use of fear. This is the word, maybe it's strong, maybe it's not the most appropriate. The fear that is used by the system and a lot of the corporation, from the big pharma to the Green Deal companies and the Western states, they are using fear and are using scientists to manipulate a lot of studies to make the population have the sentiment of fear, and they are using it to promote their agenda. And this is my question. I mean, how can scientists nowadays use the mass media, the social media, and others platforms, so they can show their perspective and a real perspective about the Green Deal, about the pandemic, about a lot of stuff that are making the population that is not trained in this domain to have this fear installed in their system. I mean, this is the question, and this is the problem that I have, and the solution that we have to find for us, so that we can explain this fear and to get rid of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important question. I'm going to first ask Jason if he would respond to that. And then I think after Jason, I'll ask Professor Battaglia. I actually don't see him. If we have him, maybe we can get him to respond as well. So Jason, go ahead.
I think that what this is representing is how environmentalism is used as the new colonialism. How nations are told that if you want access to financing, if you want access to markets, if you want to be part of the international community, you have to make certain concessions. You have to accept certain defeats for your own future in the area of energy and in the area of sovereignty. One of the biggest ways that the green agenda is pushed is not only through governments. You know, Flop 26 had little to show for itself in terms of the main goals that were stated at its creation and leading up to it. But if you look at the non-governmental sides of things, the bragging that is made about how banks, how financial institutions managing tens of trillions of dollars worth of assets are committing themselves to a zero carbon or net zero carbon future. How regulations on financing, on adding environment, sustainability, governance reporting for what should simply be business transactions, for stock market listings, things like this. And through the use of civil society, there's a push from all these different directions to prevent the growth of nations. So to your question about what role scientists can play in this, I think that scientists have an indispensable and a very unique role in a couple of ways. One of them is to directly take on the specific claims of climate catastrophe, as we've heard on this panel, to directly say, are these statements true? What are the risks? What is CO2 doing? Okay. Another aspect of it, I think, is to help create a better sense in people of what it is to be a human being. Science has as its subject the natural world, it seems. But science also has as its subject the fostering in the mind of a vivid hypothesizing process capable of making the new discoveries in the future that will unlock for us totally new approaches to biology, to energy, through nuclear fusion, through antimatter, as Professor Weiss had even brought up. So I think that acquainting people, helping people understand what it is that the human mind is capable of doing, is a part of the antidote to the cultural degradation in the new green religion, where people believe that the ultimate sin is existing, that the original sin is that there is a human species, and that our goal should be to reduce to zero or negative our impact on the world around us, when in fact it is exactly the opposite. We must increase our power over nature to improve it and to improve our own lives. So in terms of how to do that, I think that people who are informed on these things have to inject themselves into the public debate, as people on this panel have done. and to do various forms of outreach through, I mean, I don't have really tactical suggestions in terms of, reaching out to media in your area, through universities, through schools, through holding events. I mean, there are many options, but I think that sitting on the side and hoping that this will go away because it is unreasonable, that won't happen. And scientists have a specific role to play in stepping up to intervene into that.
Thanks, Jason. I see we have Professor Battaglia now. Would you like to say anything to Mr. Batescu's question? Oh, you're muted. Hold on one second. Let's see. I'm going to try again. Let's see if we can hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yes, good evening to everybody. Well, the question is actually it's not very an easy question to answer. There are several things several comments that could be made. One of these is a political, would be on a political ground. The leader in the world about this crazy behavior is Europe. And I think that once European Union will crash, and personally I hope it will crash soon, and will go back to the national interest as it was before, people will start realize that this is a major problem, is an economic problem. Why? Because the richness of a country, as has been said in one of the speech before, is the energy, the availability to energy at low price in an abundant quantity. Now, these new technologies like wind farms or solar energy, unfortunately, I must say, do not are not able to give us the energy we need. However, this technology require a huge amount of money, and there are people, of course, who are interested to get their hands on this money. However, these technologies are so unreasonable that the only way to implement them is to take people out of their power, not to give to people the power to decide who their politicians have to be, who have to be the politicians who rule their countries. Nowadays, now we live in a European Union where people don't even know who are the politicians who rule this European Union. If one asks to anybody on the streets if they know who are in the European Parliament, they don't even know who are in the European Parliament of their own countries. So every country in Europe seems to be ruled by people who nobody knows, and they are able, just because of this, to introduce laws, enforce laws that people might not agree, if only they would be able to discuss them. I see the person who has asked the question has made a sort of comparison with the pandemic. Now, I don't know how has been in other countries, but at least here in Italy, the pandemic has been described by the media with one only voice, without even allowing anybody who intended to ask question about the vaccine, about how the pandemic has been affronted by those politicians. In Italy, we have had from the pandemic more than 130,000 deaths from the pandemic. Yet we have said that the way Italy has confronted with the pandemic has been one of the best in the world. So what I think, what I'm trying to say is that people, it is already for several years that people are not able to know what the politicians are deciding, and not to control what they are deciding.
Thank you, Professor Battaglia. I think Dr. Berkhout, did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Well, I think it's a very good question, Mr. Badescu, and let me be direct and say the science system is in a crisis. That's the only thing we have to point to ourselves. Yeah, and let me tell you this: the academies of sciences, where I really have a hard time, to even discuss with them these matters, but the academies of sciences and the university management, they have adopted a business model that when you agree with the consensus, it gives you money. It's a business model. And I am ashamed about so many scientists, and especially the scientists which should know better. That's why I say again, the academies of sciences, and the leaders of the universities. They should have stand up, and they should have said, oh, politicians, what you are telling us is wrong. As Professor Battaglia exactly said, it's wrong what you're saying. Because by far we don't know what really happens in the climate system. The climate system is so complex that it's a challenge. It's great to work on it. And we are already making progress. But what we are doing now, and you explained it very nicely, Professor, is what we see is that they are trying to get their point, that CO2 is the problem, in their models. So they put in their models what they want finally to conclude. And I can tell you, this is the worst thing you can ever think of in science. So to conclude, if you go along with the consensus, you get money. If you don't go along, you get excommunicated. It's as simple as that. And that's why our conclusion should be science, and particularly climate science, but all academies of sciences agree with it. The science is in a crisis. Yeah, and the way we are educating young people, yeah, is a big shame. And my story was therefore is we have taken away their future by the stories of the scientists. We have taken away the future and say the future is terrible. Yeah, the future is so bad that the only thing that we can escape from a catastrophe is that you all get poor. And it should be the other way around. Yeah, so that's why I like, the Schiller Institute. Yeah, because we agree with the fact that the future is on people. The future is on our youngsters. The future is on science and technology. The future is on discovering what we still don't know yet. Yeah, and Mr. Batescu, that is the problem. Not the politicians. Well, of course, they don't know better. But we should tell them where the problem is. But we are silent. And if you speak up, again, you are excommunicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berkhout. And I would just say, obviously, this panel is full of outspoken people who have inserted themselves into this debate very courageously. So I would just encourage you to work with us and see how we can multiply this effect. Now, I want to pose, because I know we have a few speakers here with limited time and also for whom it's quite late in the evening. So I'm first going to pose two questions to Jason, and then after that, I have a question for Professor Pulinets. So Jason, the two questions, the first one is a little bit off topic, but because it comes up so much, I'm just hoping you can address it efficiently. And then the second one is a little bit more on topic with our panel. So the first question is, why does the Schiller Institute advocate vaccination and not the free will of the people regarding the rights over their bodies? The second one is, let me find it here. Okay, the second question, which I'll pose to Jason, is, does the notion of infinite growth make scientific or even philosophical sense? To place oneself in an improper or fundamental framework is bad form, and that's a shame. So very different.
Okay.
But hopefully you can tackle those for us.
All right. Well, thank you for these, and I'll be as quick as I can. Of course, it's hard to be quick on bringing up the whole vaccine issue, which really hasn't been the topic of this panel. I'd just say that within the question, there was a contradiction sort of implied that I don't think exists. It is both possible to advocate the availability of vaccines and their use without insisting that people must be vaccinated. I'd just like to point out that this exists. It's posed as a contradiction, and it needn't be. Another irony that exists in this, for example, is demanding vaccination at home while doing little to ensure the availability of vaccines in other poor countries, for example. On the issue of personal rights, do people have the right to receive a treatment that has been developed, has shown itself to be effective, and which they want to receive? Why are so many people in the world still waiting to get vaccines that they want? Is that right? Does that support their rights to make a choice about treatments that they get? The issue overall, there's so many different topics and directions to go in this, and I think I'll leave it at that, because that requires a whole discussion, because there's so many things that just one thing to say on it is that I think people are being called upon to make analyses of data without much in the way of tools to be able to do a good job of it. And it is an atmosphere where the potential to be misled in various directions exists very strongly, and that many of the topics in it do become quite politicized. But I would simply, come back to the broadest issue, which is, in order to support human functioning, human thriving, well-being around the world, if we say what is required, worldwide to have a economic system and a health system capable of delivering a high standard of medical care to everybody on this planet? What is the level of production required to support such a system of healthcare, the availability of healthcare? And when I say system, I don't mean, centrally administered by the WHO or something. I just mean achieving a state of development where this is possible for everyone. I think that comes right back to the topic of this panel, which is how can you have high living standards without a basic energy system that is reliable, efficient, affordable? So I'll leave it at that on that question. As far as infinite growth, I think I would turn it around and say that what would be the justification for believing that growth must be limited? Now, this was attempted already, as I discussed in my presentation, in a very famous way by the Club of Rome's book written in the 1970s called The Limits to Growth. And they were way off. There were many materials, for example, where the prediction made in the 1970s, with the 1970s computer, was that by now we would have largely exhausted our stocks of various industrial elements, manganese, nickel, cobalt, things like this. But for almost all of the elements discussed in that book, the known reserves today are actually larger due to better knowledge about the Earth's crust. For many of these substances, the ability to economically extract them has actually improved. In other words, that what was stated to be a limit 50 years ago now simply wasn't. And it arose from the wrong understanding of where a resource is located. Do resources exist within the crust of the Earth? Yes and no. Substances exist within the crust of the Earth, but they're not a resource if we can't do anything with it. And what transforms a mineral deposit of interest to a geologist into an ore of interest to an industrialist is the mind, is the fact that we've discovered a way to make use of these substances, thereby transforming them into resources. Uranium is a powerful resource today. It was not a meaningful resource 100 years ago. It just wasn't. So, or certainly 200 years ago in potential. So I would turn it around and say, if somebody believes that growth must be limited, considering that this has not been the case so far, and that one form of economic activity perhaps appears to be limited, but we've continually veered off of that path towards, running out of resources by taking a new course in which we avail ourselves of new forms of power, new forms of resources, all created through our minds, which are, of course, the greatest of resources available to us. So I would start from that limitations are overcome through the discovery of new principles, and we have several on the horizon right now. We should, I think, assume that we will be able to achieve those breakthroughs.
Thanks, Jason. All right, the next question is directed toward Professor Pulinets. So this is from Jonathan in Germany. He says, you mentioned that the current successes in predicting earthquakes are not accepted by everyone. Do you have an idea of why scientists refuse to accept those successes? And I wonder, considering the current and ongoing catastrophe in Haiti, could that earthquake, which destroyed so much on the island and killed over 300,000 people, could that earthquake have been predicted and those people rescued? And if so, why was it not predicted? Or why weren't the relevant authorities informed?
Okay, here are several questions. The number one, does not mean that all scientists does not accept our conception. The problem is that seismologists does not want to do this because it is threat to their financing. When they get financing, they substantiate this that they protect the humanity, but when they are requested to predict earthquakes, they say, no, we're not predicting. We are making science. We study the physics of the Earth's crust, formation of the faults, and so on, but we do not make prediction. So it is, I suppose, the background of this is money. The second one about Haiti, yes. We can predict earthquakes, but for this it is necessary the system like the emergency, like firemen and so on. You have the special bodies, mainly it is government bodies that work. I personally, we are several scientists. We cannot monitor all the world. It is impossible. Even in Russia, I was not able to get enough financing to organize something in Kamchatka. It's only, in comparison with the world, it is a small region. So everything was done by ourselves without any financing. And the precursors appears few days before. So it means that every day I need to monitor all the globe, which is impossible because I get money from another things. I need to work to support my family. There should be created the infrastructure to make this possible. But I have optimistic information. There appeared very young company which is named Quantectum. It is registered in Switzerland, and I suppose by united their efforts, and they make their indication of their dangerous regions all over the world. And if we will have these spots, and they make forecasts for several weeks up to 2 months, if we will have these hot spots, so it will be easier to monitor. In this case, I suppose we will be more successful in predicting earthquakes in the real time. What regards Haiti, if anybody is interested, I can demonstrate all precursors before this earthquake. But taking into account that I do not monitor in real time all the world, of course we missed this earthquake because we did not look at this point for a proper moment.
Thank you, Professor Pulinets. All right, the next question I had planned to pose to Professor Weiss, but I see that he wasn't able to stay with us. So I'm going to read this. This is on the issue of nuclear power in Germany, but more generally. So I'll read it and first pose it to Dr. Kemm, and then anyone else who wants to answer. So this is from Jan Christian Lewitz in Germany. He says, I myself am a German physicist and work internationally in nuclear technology. The role of Germany in a climate-friendly, low air pollutant production, independent of wind and solar, of safe and economic nuclear power is disappointing. Germany has ordered the end of nuclear production by the end of 2022. 3 of 6 remaining nuclear power plants have to shut down by the end of 2021. I know that, for example, Russia, China, and India and other countries are currently expanding the use of nuclear, while Germany is trying to force every other country possible to follow the German way of destruction, of industry, of nature, etc. The use of current light water reactor technology, followed by innovative fourth-generation plants under development, will enable mankind to be provided with cheap and clean electricity, heat, propulsion, and last but not least, potable water from seawater. Nuclear power reduces the risks of wars over energy, resources, and food. It will help end poverty and enable a good life for the people around the world. So he's asking about Germany, but I would obviously broaden the question too. He asks, what can be done to shift Germany and other EU countries back on the track of nature and people-friendly use of nuclear power? So Dr. Kemm, would you like to take that up?
Well, I feel that what we're seeing at the moment in Germany is the result of political pressures, not the result of the opinions of scientists and engineers, technologists who really know what they're doing. And so to me, it's very interesting to see what's happening in Germany, that sort of popular votes by large groups of people who really don't know what they're doing is having such a pressurizing effect on the government. And as we heard earlier, the whole EU system where people don't even know who the EU representatives are, that what you're seeing as a result of this political pressure, you're not seeing the result of German brains and science. For many years, Germany has been a world leader in technology and innovation. I believe there's still a huge amount of technology and innovation in Germany, but as far as this is concerned, it's being suppressed by the politics. Now, if I'd just like to make mention of another topic that has come up a few times related to this. One hears about the limits to growth. And you say, are there limits to growth? And the answer is clearly, the answer is yes, there are limits to growth if you limit technological innovation. We heard earlier from another speaker, the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stone. It's quite true. But the Stone Age would have continued at that level had they been prevented from discovering bronze. As soon as they discovered bronze, they were able to get more food and therefore sustain larger communities and so on. Then iron was discovered, the Iron Age came about, which meant you could expand and have a better way of life. Then the steam engine enabled clothes to be produced much more cheaply because they gave motive power to the weaving and the clothes making industry and so on. So each technological advance has enabled more growth to take place. There's an erroneous assumption that growth just means the consumption of more coal, more this, more that, and so on. And that's not the case. Growth is different technologies coming about. You know, there's well-known stories about people in the early 1800s calculating how many horses there would be in London in 100 years' time because transport was expanding. Nobody took into account at that stage the horses would be replaced by cars and buses and so on. It's my firm belief that in the future, the whole world will run on nuclear power. I think there's no doubt about that. We're going to have nuclear reactors on Mars and on the moon and so on too. That's the only solution. Already there's nuclear power sources in space. The Perseverance rover driving around on Mars' surface right now is nuclear powered. So I've got no doubt that that is going to happen. We're in a transitional phase at the moment where the world is being scared to death, as Dr. Guus Berkhout has pointed out, that people are being scared into putting a clamp on this. So what's happening is there's a clamp on nuclear because there are groups of people who don't want their technology to become available. They don't want that extra energy to become available. They don't want the growth to occur. So they're putting a limit on growth artificially and saying, rather live with wind and solar. They say there's no solar at night. And they say, fine, that's okay. Just go to bed when the sun goes down like people used to do. They actually said that to me in discussions. And so the point of pushing for this wind and solar and excluding other sources like nuclear, which produces no CO2, I do not believe the CO2 is causing the climate change, but the CO2 is an undoubted major political problem right now. So if you're so right, that nuclear doesn't produce CO2. But they then come along and say, oh, but nuclear produces this nuclear waste, which is also actually a silly story. It's completely incorrect. And that the amount of high-level nuclear waste produced by nuclear is so incredibly small that it really is inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. And scientists know exactly how to handle nuclear waste. The story that we don't know nuclear waste, it's an unsolved problem, it's beyond our capability, that's just plain and simply not true. So I think this whole thing about limits to growth is that political groupings are trying to make a limit to growth come about by blocking extra energy, by blocking expansions in technology. And limits to growth is not just this unconstrained consumption, which scares people. I can understand why they get scared. No, already we've got LED lights, for example, which produce light with much less electricity consumption than the old incandescent bulbs. We've got all sorts of energy-saving devices and cleverer ways of doing things. And more technological advance will allow the lifestyle of people, which is growth, to improve. It will allow economies to go forward, but not with just this unconstrained sort of consumption and the waste dumping of all sorts of things and so on, which is the scary image. So there's no limit to growth as long as you don't try and put blockages in the way of technology.
Thank you. It's very important. I know Jason has to go, so I'm just going to turn to him and see if he has any last responses to anything that's been said or anything he wants to say.
Sure. Just, I guess, two things. One is about just to re-stress the origin of the outlook that we're fighting against right now. And that although, there may be, people might think that leftist circles promote the climate change catastrophism, therefore it comes from the left, for example, it's just not true. As we saw at Flop 26, this is the world's financial leaders, they're not much in the way of leaders. But this truly is an oligarchical outlook, and it's not any different than the promotion of Malthus centuries ago, at a time when he had said, when the world's population was far below what it is today, that we were going to reach the limits to growth, and that it was inevitable, and that trying to help people live better was an exercise in futility, since the population was simply going to surpass what could be supported by the resources of the earth and agriculture. He was wrong. He was promoted at the time, and that same outlook is alive today. And so that's why it's essential in combating it to address, I think, the nature of the human identity and the double importance of understanding the role of science from the standpoint of creating new resources, and the other aspect from the standpoint of understanding what it is to be a human being. I know that the next panel on culture will address this from a different direction, but science and science education has a very special role to play, particularly among young people, but not only, in helping people understand what their mind is capable of sharing that experience with other young people. This should be what occurs in schools, not rote memorization of formulas, which may be correct. That's not the problem. The point is, where is that process of discovery? And then on the economic side, just one thing would be to refer back to the work of Lyndon LaRouche in thinking through a specific way of understanding that nonlinear characteristic of true economic growth. As other speakers have said, it's not more of whatever you've got. It's more than whatever you had. It's the creation of a real new future through expanding that resource base and trying to understand the economic value of those new resources in terms of the old resources, trying to put a dollar value on something that simply could not have been created from that earlier stage, runs into difficulties like those that came up in trying to quantify the value of the US moon mission, where economists arrived at a number of roughly 10 to 1 in terms of the economic benefits, in terms of the initial cost to go to the moon. But such numbers always fail for the two reasons that the benefits continue indefinitely, and second, that you didn't get 10 of what you used to have. We had entirely new technologies. And so therefore, attempting through linear approaches to understand the economic value of technology itself leads to undervaluing, to undercounting, to misestimating the value both of technology and, for a different reason that I won't say, infrastructure, which both need far more investment than they are receiving today from governments.
Okay, Well, thanks a lot, Jason, and thanks for being with us. So we have another question that's come in directed toward Professor Battaglia. So this is from Betty Jennings in the United States. She asks, how can two scientists win a Nobel Prize on their computer climate models, which are inaccurate? Shouldn't they admit that the modeling is wrong and change their assumptions? These two scientists should open up public discussion on where the modeling went wrong and that the mathematics couldn't predict 200,000 years of solar phases in our solar system. Why is it such a taboo to challenge a Nobel Prize winner?
Well, I don't think the two scientists who got the Nobel Prize are definitely excellent scientists. What I think is that the Nobel Prize committee has made a mistake. They just said, they just thought that the models, which are quite complicated programs to write, because the climate system is the most complex system one can think of. They just thought that the models were validated because they said, if we run the models without human forcing, we don't get agreement with the experiments. When we add human forcing, then we get agreement. And then they conclude, then the models are validated, the humans are responsible for the warming. But there is another way out of this, and the way out is there is another possibility of this disagreement, that the models were wrong. Now, I don't know whether it's a big challenge to challenge the Nobel Prize. After all, the Nobel Prize is not is made by humans, and the humans could make also a mistake. I don't think Nobel Prize is a very important thing to. After all, consensus is an oxymoron. Is a contradiction. There is no consensus in science. What is important in science are the facts, and the facts are that in the case of the models, that the models have not predicted Roman warming, medieval warming, Holocenic warming. They failed in predicting the warming for the future. They failed to predict, to construct the temperature pattern of the atmosphere. So the models are wrong. And the Nobel Prize Committee was wrong as well. So what?
Okay, thank you. All right, so another question that's come in, which I'll throw open to anyone who would like to respond. This is from Ulf Sandmark in Sweden, and he's asking he's asking any of the speakers to comment on the final resolution of COP26. He says this is one of the first conferences of science who I think he means who's actually qualified to comment on COP26. So I know some of you addressed that in your speeches, but if anyone would like to say anything further on that. Maybe Dr. Berkhout, we start with you.
Yes, okay. Well, the bad thing about COP26 is that climate change was one-to-one connected to CO2 emission. So actually, the whole COP26 was focused on CO2. Now, as was said already earlier, if that connection between global warming and CO2 emission is actually and let me say it nicely, yeah, a very weak connection, then of course you're wasting an entire meeting of 10,000s of people, and you make decisions, and you try to get an agreement, which has nothing to do, yeah, with the real problem. I've always like to formulate it like that. Climate change is much more than CO2. And CO2 is much more than climate change. And that is extremely important because we know how important CO2 is for life. And we know already that the current models, yeah, even the Nobel Prize committee went wrong on that. These models are just wrong. They are not validated. Yeah, and already for 40 years, they predict something which is not a little bit wrong, but it's a lot wrong. And we know why it is. Yeah, because validation is something else than verification. But I don't go into detail about that. So to conclude, yeah, I would say is I hope that this COP26 is the very last conference in its sort. Yeah, because yeah, it starts with the wrong principle. And we know what is happening at the moment because you see that with all these climate measures that have been taken, yeah, you see, of course, that energy prices are rising. And we see, of course, that food prices, therefore, are rising. And we see, of course, that hunger, yeah, will increase. Yeah. So it is not the climate change that is the problem. It is the climate policies that are the problem.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on the question?
If I may make a comment.
Sure.
What's also very worrying about where the COP is going is that they are now giving instructions at the end in the form of these resolutions, for example, to get rid of the coal. And to my mind, this is like a world government forming, giving orders to the sub-elements. In our case, sitting here in South Africa and other African countries, we sort of see this group of developed European countries and so on, sending out an instruction, you will not use coal. You will just crash your economy. You will collapse. You will not make more clinics for your people. You will not advance education. You will not do this. You will not do that. Because preventing coal use in a number of African countries just means you're just totally blocking the advance of the economy. The wind and solar doesn't work adequately. It doesn't work. If you look at the sizes that I've mentioned before, the whole of Europe is small, and the whole of Europe electrically is incredibly interconnected. In England, they draw hydropower from Norway under the ocean. They draw nuclear power from France under the ocean. So all of Europe is each other's insurer. Nobody can collapse without just automatically getting electricity over the border. That's not the case in Africa. No, African countries are on their own. South Africa has some exports that we do of electricity to neighboring countries, and we have a couple of very minor imports, but the amount of electricity moving over the border is very small. And other countries, there's much less of this trade. If you ban certain other African countries from expanding their electricity production, you're just condemning the country. A number of African countries are only 15% electrified, 20% electrified. The only honorable thing they can do is double their electricity consumption, then double it again, and double it again, and again. And that is the way they address the population and how they can increase the quality of life, which means there will be a natural limitation on births, a natural limitation on the growth of other things, such as burning fires at night using wood and dung and so on, which really is polluting. So you've got to allow their growth to occur. You can't block it. And to my mind, that is serious when people sit in these rooms in Glasgow and make rulings across the world as if the whole world is somehow a uniform type of place where some ruling coming out of Glasgow is applicable to everybody else. It just isn't. And I'm glad to see African leaders like President Buhari of Nigeria and certain others saying, essentially, go and jump in the ocean. We're not going to listen to you. And I've got no option but to agree with that. We've got to advance our own cause in the most responsible, sensible way possible. Here in South Africa, we're using a lot of coal very well, and we are advancing the nuclear program. We already have nuclear. We're going to be expanding nuclear some more. That's already started. And I just hope that we advance nuclear much, much more into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, because the point you raise, this colonial intention over other nations of the world, I want to bring in a question which was sent in, which I don't know that we have the ability to answer on this panel. It's directed to Paul Gallagher, who was our keynote speaker yesterday. But I at least wanted to read it to be on the record, so to speak, for this panel, because it does raise an important dimension that we would be remiss to leave out, I think. And then perhaps we can send it on to Paul for perhaps a video answer. But the question from Renee Sigerson is this. Senator Thompson referenced the tax swindle that has just been reintroduced by the United States so-called infrastructure bill into the magic mixture used by politicians to keep the discredited Green New Deal in effect. What needs to be emphasized is that this is just the tiny tip of the iceberg on what is really happening with the financial system. The Green New Deal is a smokescreen for the fact that the financial elites know that the transatlantic financial system is in fact bankrupt. Yesterday, Paul Gallagher referenced the financial reorganization concepts needed to get control of this and put transatlantic finances in the hands of responsible people. Science has been under attack for decades because the Malthusians know that a dedication to science is irreconcilable with the monetarist and Malthusian blueprints that have dominated the 20th century and led to 2 world wars. Paul should tell us how we can haircut the derivatives market and pour funds into the infrastructure projects that would turn the tide. So I'm going to leave that there more as, I think, an important comment from Renee, and then we'll pass the question on to Paul Gallagher for an answer. But here's what I would like to do. I have one more question I want to read and open up to all of you. And then after that, we'll go to concluding remarks if there's anything remaining that you want to say. So here's the question. This turns to the issue of the youth and the culture. This is from Fred Haight, who sends it in from Canada. He says, recently, I had a conversation with a fellow in his 30s who was railing about climate change. When I confronted him with the fact that there is scientific opposition, of which he was unaware, he paused and said, well, one thing I know for sure, man is bad. Most of these excellent presentations have been made by older people, old enough to have experienced the enforced paradigm shift from enthusiasm and optimism to unbounded pessimism. Younger people are several generations into the enforced paradigm shift and not only lack access to the earlier beautiful idea of man having dominion over nature, but view it as a problem. Has there ever been a situation before where an oligarchy induced a large section of humanity to hate itself? Facts alone will not change how they think. So how do we address the problem at a deeper level? Would anyone like to take, it's quite a question. Would anyone like to take it on? Dr. Berkhout, go ahead.
Sorry that I have to leave. So let me quickly,
please,
because it's in the heart of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And it's a big item in clientele. And let me just make a short remark and then have to leave it to you. And that is, from early on, you see that our youngsters, when they're even, young kids at the primary school and then at the secondary school, they're completely brainwashed by this negative issue. So they're completely brainwashed by saying that their parents and grandparents did it wrong. I talk often with them. And so we cannot expect that they immediately believe us because we are the parents and grandparents. So we are the bad guys or girls. So the point I want to make is that if we don't start with the educational system, then we will not be successful. And let me say one thing that always I find out when I talk to them is they completely confuse climate change and the wellness of our natural environment. And if we could split that, that would already be a blessing. Because I can tell you that if we agree with the youngsters that we should have much better stewardship about our planet, and that we should take care of our planet, and that with our science and technology, we can do that. Then we have, of course, half of the battle won. And then if you have made the vision, then you can go to the climate and tell them, about the huge forces, and about the past. It was nicely said already in this session. So, to say it, the educational system, and also from our point of view, let us make a clear distinction between the environmental care, our stewardship about our planet, things about the circular economy, so that's the raw material on the one end, and about climate change on the other. They are completely different issues. And the only thing, and that's why I like Schiller, is the only thing is educate them. Science and technology. And that will bring us further. And I agree with Dr. Kemm. I say it a little bit differently. I say it in this way always is unlimited growth means unlimited growth of added value. And the more science and technology we bring in, the larger we increase our added value. And if we say we have unlimited brains, making things possible, we have also unlimited added value, which bring us everywhere. Sorry, I have to leave, but I think it was a great session. And I like to keep in touch with you because you're great guys.
Thanks for being with us, Dr. Berkhout. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so before we go to any concluding remarks, would anyone else like to address Fred's question about how do we get through to the young generations? How do we break them out of the pessimism?
I think if I can make a comment there, and that is that if one can call it, the two sides of the confrontation are not playing by the same rules. Now, you can just imagine if you were playing football and rugby on a field with two different teams, a football team and a rugby team, there'd be constant confusion. And so what you find is that the scientists always are honest. They tell the truth. They do it quietly. They do it gently because that's how scientists are trained. The extreme greens at the other end of the spectrum are prepared to do street demonstrations, block roads, wave banners, assault people, and do all sorts of absolutely unacceptable things, which means the authorities tend to buckle under the pressure from the extreme greens. They don't go and stop the street demonstrations. They allow it to occur. They allow all these things to happen. And so the scales are highly tilted. And what the people are seeing in education, like the young people, that is, they're seeing the press stories about the demonstrations and the Gretas of this world sort of crying on television and so on and so forth. And there's a huge emotional content in there, which is getting the upper hand. And when you try to say, can we calmly, quietly look at the truth? Then the extreme greens say, yes, but he's a denier. You can't actually believe him. You'll find anybody who tries to counter it is immediately accused of being dishonest, a denier, some secret motive, and all those sorts of things. And that is where, at the political leadership level, we somehow need them to try and ensure that the rules stay in place, the rules of debate. And this is where the leaders of the country, which include people like the bankers and so on, bankers getting together to say they don't want to give any money to coal plants and coal projects, which means they're going to just happily damage whole countries, to my mind, is unacceptable. So we need to look at those rules of the game as well and then try and address it, because it's a very serious problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So why don't we turn now, we have just a couple of minutes, why don't we turn now, how about first to Professor Battaglia? Is there anything else you'd like to say, any other responses or message to leave us with?
Well, maybe two things. One, very short, is that I would like to remind the COP26. The 26 means that these people are already they got together for 26 times, which means that they have failed 26 times. Now they're going to meet again in Egypt for COP27, I guess, for what I have understood. So it will be at the 27th failure. So I wonder when these people will realize that they've been failing so many times. With this one point I could make. Another point I would like to make is that I think that I'm quite, in a way, I'm quite optimistic, because those young people like Greta Thunberg and others, those people are really, they are a minority among the young people. I think that 90% of the people are not like are not so pessimistic. They don't follow Greta Thunberg. Now, where is the problem then? The problem is that there are two different realities. The reality that is given to us by the media, and the real reality. So until the media are controlled by people who try to rule the whole planet without nobody having given them the power to rule the whole planet, we have no way out. So I think we have to go back to the position where people are able to decide who their leaders have to be.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Pulinets, any final remarks to us?
Okay, I would like to say two optimistic things which is going in Russia. First, about the northern, how to say, Northern Sea route. We put the icebreaker with a nuclear plant on board, and this nuclear plant is providing electricity to the whole city there. So no pollution, no emitting of carbon dioxide. This is the first thing. Second, that Russia is now developing the new type of reactor, so-called reactor on the fast neutrons. The advantage of this reactor is that it transforms and elaborates all types on nuclear substances, including the nuclear waste. So after this reactor, there is no any nuclear waste. So it will be completely clear from the nuclear remains. And I suppose in 2 or 3 years, this reactor will be run. So looking to the perspective of the nuclear energy, these are two very positive facts.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Dr. Kemm, any very brief final parting remark from you?
I think if one looks at COP26 and sees what positives came out of it, something to note is that running up to COP26 and during, there were a lot more pro-nuclear articles that came out in the media and a lot more articles questioning the whole story about climate change. Whereas a few years ago, there was virtually nothing. So I think that a positive out of all of this is that it's caused a lot of people to think. I think it's gone, the extreme green philosophies have gone so far that journalists and others are saying, wait a minute, let's sit down and think a little bit. And so I see that I think we are turning a corner. I think we've already probably turned the corner, and that this will result now in a lot more probing about, is this whole green thing true? Is the wind and solar really the answer? And so on. And I think a lot more good questions are going to come out of this. I see some positives coming out of it in that sense. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you. Thank you, Professor Battaglia, Professor Pulinets, and Dr. Kemm. I also want to thank those speakers who couldn't be with us at this moment, which is Jason Ross, Dr. Berkhout, Professor Weiss, Senator Mike Thompson, and I think that's it. I think I got everyone. So again, thank you all so much. One thing I want to mention before I let us all go for a break is the LaRouche Legacy Foundation published last year the first volume of the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche, which includes, very importantly, a couple of crucial economics works, which I would urge everyone to study in light of yesterday's discussion on economics and today's discussion, including a paper from 1983 that he wrote called There Are No Limits to Growth. So you can get that on the LaRouche Legacy Foundation website, which you see at the bottom of your screen there. So that concludes our third panel. Again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to everyone watching. We will resume the final panel of our conference in 1 hour at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The topic, or the title rather, of that panel is The Beauty of True Human Culture. So we'll see you all then.